To celebrate the International Day for Universal Access to Information, join UNESCO in affirming and reiterating the urgency to respect and maintain the right to information, especially amid the COVID-19 outbreak. In times of emergencies such as the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to protect the right to access information so that communities can protect themselves and their families. Journalists debunk the falsehoods and report the facts about the disease. Scientists and policymakers provide us with directives and guidance on how to cope with the pandemic. Citizens can know the measures to prevent and mitigate the risks. That's why we need public information without delay, with strong and effective institutions to keep citizens informed. Access to information is not a burden, but a right that needs to be supported by law, and any restrictions to this right should conform to the law, be proportionate and limited to protect the citizens. Join our high-level webinar on 28 September and all the online events across the world that UNESCO and partners are organizing to celebrate our right to access information. Go to our website for more information. Access to information, saving lives, building trust, bringing hope.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Welcome to the panelists and to everyone who's watching us on YouTube, be it directly on this link or on YouTube around the world. This is a webinar hosted by UNESCO with Access Info Europe and the Open Government Partnership to mark International Access to Information Day, or Right to Know Day, as it was originally called. This is the first time we're celebrating this day as a UN day. I think it's about the third or fourth time it's a UNESCO day, and it's actually 18 years since a group of activists met in Sofia in Bulgaria and actually came up with the idea of having a day dedicated to the right of access to information. Since that time, around 80 countries around the world have adopted new access to information laws, and the right of access to information as a fundamental human right linked to freedom of expression has been recognized by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, the UN Human Rights Committee, and many other international human rights bodies. It's actually a great pleasure to have on this webinar this afternoon Shushan Doidoyen, who was one of the people, along with myself and another person called Karen Andreasen, who, if I'm not wrong, who came up with the idea of having the right of access to information, a special day to mark it. And it's a great pleasure and honor for us that we've actually had that right recognized as a right, and the day recognized as a right, and that we're able to celebrate it here together with UNESCO this afternoon. UNESCO having a special role now to play in the implementation and defense of this right, because UNESCO is charged with overseeing SDG, Sustainable Development Goal Indicator 16.10.2, which is that every country has a law and implements that law on the right of access to information. So that's something that gives UNESCO a very important role in defending this right. And we're here meeting virtually, I don't need to say it, because of the particular unique conditions of 2020 and the fact that we are in the midst of a global pandemic. And as that video very strongly brought home the message, information has proved itself during the course of this year to be absolutely essential as one of the tools that we need to fight the pandemic. If we weren't ever fully convinced of this before, I think 2020 has really brought home to us how information can actually save lives and how we all need it to get through this pandemic, as well as to defend our democracies and human rights. I'm going to just introduce our speakers and then say a couple of words about the nature of this webinar, and then we'll get going with what I hope will be a very dynamic and interactive debate. So first of all, we have, and I don't know if you've got your camera on, I can't see you, but I hope you're there, Ilaria Febola the legal officer from Article 19, an organization where I started my career, in fact. Ilaria, are you with us?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, Ilaria. Nice to see you. Delia Ferreira Rubio, who is chair of Transparency International. And I also have the honor of sharing a civil society seat on the Open Government Partnership Steering Committee with Delia. Delia.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Ellen.
Hello.
Thank you for the invitation.
Good afternoon. We then have Ania Calderon, Executive Director at the Open Data Charter, someone with whom I've been working a lot this year as we try to keep data open during this pandemic. Ania, welcome.
Thank you, Helen. It's a pleasure to be here.
And last but not least, and I've already mentioned her name, Shushan Doidoyan, joining us from the Freedom of Information Center Armenia, one of the civil society organizations which helped initiate the creation of this very important day for transparency activists around the world. Welcome, Shushan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you,
Hello.
Helen, and thank you for this invitation. It's really a great pleasure and honor for me to be on this very special day here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shushan. From Access Info, we've been putting information about our panel on the social media, and I've been very impressed by the number of comments that we've had about the fact that it's an all-female panel, and a lot of people congratulating us for that. It worked out that way. We actually tried, like always, to get a bit of gender balance, but we felt that it's when the gender balance falls this way by accident almost, we felt it wasn't such a bad thing. So it is really fantastic to have some of the leading ladies of the transparency world here today, and I'm sure we're going to get a dynamic discussion. So I'm going to ask 2 rounds of kind of quick fire rounds of questions. I think before that we have another, if I'm not wrong, we have another video clip with testimonials. Could we have the video and then we'll get straight to the debate? Thank you. Thanks very much for that video, and as you'll have seen, we've got a couple of hashtags for today, so all of those who are following, who wish to take screenshots, tweet, comment, interact on social media, feel free to do so. We've got colleagues watching the social media. So let's get to the debate. The first question goes to Ilaria Fevola, legal officer from Article 19. Now, Article 19, Ilaria, has issued several reports about the pandemic, about the COVID-19 crisis and access to information around the world. Could you very briefly highlight for us the kind of good and bad practices that you've seen? And I don't know whether you could express whether you think that the pandemic's been positive or it's been negative for human rights, such as the right to information and of course the right to privacy, which needs to be put in balance with the right to information. What's your initial impressions of what's happened during 2020?
Thank you, Helen. So as we have really well seen from the videos they've just been broadcasted, in response to the COVID-19 outbreak, Many governments have taken measures to respond to the pandemic, and one of the measures that was taken was sometimes to and warningly to limit access to information held by public bodies, particularly COVID-19 related information, but also information about other areas of public interest. So what we have seen and we observed with great concern was that governments took what we have called a functional or operational approach towards access to information. I mean, they, in responding to this outbreak that nobody was expecting, they decided to restructure, prioritize some area, reduce and reallocate some resources. And they many times lack of considering access to information as a fundamental right or a human right that was subjected to the limitations established by international law. It means necessity and proportionality. And so there were cases where the possibility of filing access to information request was suspended for a certain period of time. Like I remember very well, Italy suspending the service for 3 months. Or in some cases, there were, I mean, less straightforward, but still concerning. There were some delays announced in responding to access to information requests. Some information commissions were more taking more into account the proportionality requirement, in the sense they just said that COVID-19 related access to information requests would have been prioritized. And I remember a very good example from New Zealand that issued a very important statement, the Information Commissioner, about how transparency was important and how access to information was a right that needs to be protected during the pandemic. So what I can say, so this was at the very beginning, what happened, everybody was surprised, but now, after 6 months of the pandemic, we can really see that access to information is still taking some battering, but is still surviving. And it really showed its importance and how crucial it was even more. So the other area that was problematic that we saw is the lack of publication of key information for the pandemic. And that was the other side of the proactive disclosure from governments. And there was this, what we have defined, a global failure to ensure the public was made aware of important information they needed to understand the crisis, to react, and also to coordinate conducts, to put in place their conducts accordingly. So now the area that are still really suffering is there are still delays in replying to access to information requests in many information commissions around the world. Is not as problematic as it was at the beginning, but still these need to be strengthened, and the right to information, the right to access to information needs to be maintained. And of course, the other area that is still problematic and we're really fighting to raise awareness about is the culture sometimes of secrecy and privacy invoked as a reason not to disclose key information. Just to give an example, what is going on in the UK right now, still schools are not publishing cases of pupils getting infected, invoking some privacy. And so this is still happening. So after 6 months, and is worrying. So, and what we have really seen about this approach of a culture of secrecy or invoking privacy not to disclose relevant information is this counterproductive, because this brings a culture and environment of distrust in the people and challenge to much needed public health efforts. So as the Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General said, this is the moment when transparency needs to be ensured more than ever, because governments need to do this for the people they seek to protect. So my closing highlight of this is transparency on the full extent of the crisis, so covering all areas that have been impacted, is really crucial and essential. And it is essential to ensure public trust and to open a public analysis, a public debate, and also is essential to ensure accountability. So the free flow of information is really essential in order to make everybody aware, build a sense of trust, and to respond to the pandemic.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Ilaria. Yes, I mean, stressing the importance of information, that's absolutely clear. Listening to what you were saying, it sounds as if sometimes governments restricted the right, almost as a kind of collateral damage to what else was going on, or without necessarily intending, not thinking through this is a right and we're going to limit it, but just it was something that happened. And we learned from that in it that civil society responded and pushed back against that initial situation. But we still have these difficulties in knowing exactly where the boundary between openness and privacy lies, for example. So there are things that we maybe have managed to rectify in the first months of this crisis, but there are things that we still need to work on. We can come back to discussing maybe the agenda for how we do that as we move forward with this webinar. But now let me turn to Delia Ferreira Rubio, Chair of Transparency International. Delia, we're in a moment when people are talking about a global rethink in many spheres: economics, climate, healthcare, education. And I'm sure that also for the anti-corruption integrity activists like those at Transparency International, this is something that you're also looking at very closely, perhaps how we can turn the crisis into an opportunity as well to strengthen some of our mechanisms and institutions. How do you see that we could ensure that both the policy and the regulatory responses to this crisis are done in a way that really upholds and advances the public good? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for the question. Of course, we are very worried about what happened with information during the crisis and what is still happening. In my view, information has been one of the victims of the pandemic, very clearly. And access to information as a trend in the world has been put in quarantine. That's what we have seen in many, many countries. Of course, there are exceptions. Ilaria mentioned New Zealand. We can talk about open contracting in Colombia, but these are exceptions. The rule has been that access to information has been denied operationally, functionally, or on purpose by governments. And not only that, what we have seen, and the World Health Organization said that already in March, when the pandemic was declared, we are suffering also an infodemic, which has to do with health and the real situation that governments has to resolve in terms of public policies vis-a-vis the health emergency. Now we have the same infodemic in terms of economy, in terms of using of the trillions of dollars that are coming in form of aid packages or emergency subsidies or loans to governments. So we are worried, and from the anti-corruption world, what we are asking is to come back to the basic, that is rule of law, accountability, transparency, and not only having the rules in place or having the laws approved. What we need is really enforcement, timely enforcement of those controls. And even in terms of accountability, for instance, we are pushing for concomitant control of the use of the resources, the public resources that are at stake. Because if we don't control that or don't hold to account that problem, we will not solve neither the general risk of lack of information or misinformation, even distributed by governments. We cannot resolve or face corruption risks without a proper mechanism of accountability, transparency, and access to information. And that's it, because in emergencies, the risks of corruption increase notably, particularly because in this case, we have the conversion of an emergency, which means rapid responses, the need of urgency, people don't taking care of institutional arrangement or restrictions to power, and the health sector. And you know that health sector is one of the most prone to corruption sectors in normal times. In normal times, it is estimated that $500 billion a year are lost because of corruption in health system. Imagine in a global emergency like this. So procurement in health system, or what is called COVID contracts, should be a main issue that we should be looking at and asking from governments, and being very active on the civil society side to control that. And not only in terms of the ventilators or the tests, but I have one concern in the future, especially for public procurement, transparency, or access to information. It's vaccines. Because we are already seeing countries or governments saying that they are investing huge amounts of money in purchasing vaccines that don't even exist now, that nobody knows how will that work in the future, but they are just announcing in order to pacify the anxiousness of the population, we will buy this and that numbers of doses of the vaccines. Well, I would like to see the figures, to see the resources they are already investing in that, and how these procurement arrangements has been taking place or being arranged, because why this lab and not the other lab, for instance? So that would be a point for governments and civil society to take care very carefully, or to look into details very carefully. And I think that one positive aspect of this crisis, or challenge becoming opportunity, as you say, is that civil society organizations all over the world have worked very hard to supplement the access to information when governments has put the quarantine title there, or have put the tools and the mechanism in quarantine, because we have seen all over the world monitoring efforts from civil society organizations, open contracting initiatives from civil society plus governments in some cases. We are tracking, for instance, in the Central Transparency International, we are tracking all IMF emergency packs in packages, in order to know, and to, of course, made it public, which of those packages include anti-corruption and transparency and accountability measures, and which countries are receiving huge amounts of money without any conditionality or any guarantee of accountability and transparency. So I think we have the opportunity to go back to principles and to go back to effectiveness in terms of access to information.
Thanks very much for that, Delia. So essentially, to try to summarize what you've been saying, we've seen certain risks, like risks of corruption, increase during this pandemic. The tools, we know what they should be, but the question is having them actually implemented properly in order to avoid some of those risks. You said information in quarantine. At one point during the pandemic, with the Open Data Charter, Access Info hosted an event called, I think it was Lifting Information Out of Lockdown. So very much the same idea. Ania Calderon, Executive Director of the Open Data Charter. When it comes to open data, we see that the World Health Organization has been calling both for sort of open data, but also for more data sharing between countries. Do you think that either at the national level or at the global level, we yet have clarity on the kinds of data we should be publishing, on how we should be sharing it? And if not, what kinds of recommendations have you been looking at? What do you think that we should be doing in order to ensure that we're not caught out in the same way with a lot of data that isn't, for example, interoperable, or with data that's not properly collected or that's not published in ways that it can be easily reused? How do you see the challenges that we face based on the lessons that we've learned during the last few months? Thank you, Anya.
Yes, thanks, Helen. So I think it has been really well laid out by the previous panelist, how it has become clear that COVID-19 has exposed fault lines in our information ecosystem. And most notably, as you've also mentioned, there's, I think, a lack of adequate infrastructure, the kinds of institutions that we need to support timely and responsible flows of data, as well as being able to ensure trustworthy use. We have already seen how access to quality and timely data have been instrumental in helping model and flatten the curve and informing decision-making around the world. But at the same time, there are legitimate concerns that have already been raised in terms of how data is used both now and in the future. So at the Open Data Charter, we think that any approach to governing or making decisions about data, context really matters in order to better understand the different levels of risks and benefits that are involved. For example, Delia already mentioned how the health sector is one of the most prone to corruption. So we shouldn't treat health data the same as we do transport data or data, for example, about those in positions of power. And although it has been increasingly apparent how data impacts and shapes our societies, I think we have mostly responded with top-down regulations that, while they are crucially important in introducing a set of a battery of norms and responsibilities, we need to do more to translate these into policies and practices. So in that sense, I want to share 4 preliminary findings from our Open COVID data consultations, where we are looking for practical actions that are needed towards supporting open data governance pathways. One of them has to do with the lack of transparency, the lack of consistency in how we quantify, report, and interpret the actual scope of the pandemic. And it's right that, you know, this global problem will require much more international joined up action than what we're seeing. This needs to be backed up by data that means the same things across jurisdictions. So yes, standards do matter. The second one is that transparency and accountability are crucial for the public to trust decisions, very much in line with Delia's proposition to go back to basics. You know, we are seeing a very strong demand for tracking how funds are mobilized, and that there is the ability for anyone to scrutinize that these are actually being distributed equitably to those that need it most. We are also very supportive too about, I saw the recent call from Access Info to increase proactive publication of crucial data on health, decision-making, spending, and public procurement. And we also think that these efforts need to be backed up with good and honest communication about how these data are gathered and also what are the types of limitations that they may have. The third one has to do with sensibly sharing and opening up privacy-preserving data about vulnerable populations. We think this is crucial to mitigate the impact of this and future pandemics if we want to put the hardest hit communities at the center of any COVID-19 response. But this can only be done while we have adequate measures to protect against surveillance and profiling of different demographic groups. And the last one, the last insight that we have captured is something that has come up time and again in our recent discussions, is that governments and data stewards must be able to adapt and adjust much more rapidly than what we're seeing. We can no longer rely on monolithic institutions or infrastructures. And similarly, our data systems must be more dynamic and responsive to move with the times. This means new types of data institutions or context-specific data governance models will need to come up that can turn into new institutions or can also be adopted by existing institutions. But most importantly, it's not just about building these frameworks, it's also about investing in the skills and training the people that will uphold the fundamental principles behind these institutions. So to end to your question, Helen, I think international instruments for sharing health-related data during times of crisis will be crucially important, but they also need to be met with bottom-up standard-setting bodies. We need to invest in people and institutions and empower independent oversight mechanisms so that we are able to adequately address any vulnerabilities that may arise.
Super, thanks very much indeed, Anya. You talked about having special mechanisms for times of crisis, but also listening to what you were saying and to what the Delia and Delaria were saying as well, it almost sounds like we just need to get it right, crisis or no crisis, in fact. And this is Delia's back to basics message, and some of the things that Delaria was saying as well, about making sure that we really recognize this fundamental right of access to information. And if we get everything right, even designed for normal times, like our data collection, which we found lacking, then maybe we'll be better placed to ride out any particular crisis. So we learn the lesson from the crisis to get things right, medium and long term as well. Although we're not out of the crisis yet, so that makes it even more imperative that we act pretty urgently. Thanks for that very nice structure on your Lessons learned and insights there, and that we can get the balance. Maybe we can come back to talking about this, but we can get the balance of privacy right. It's a bit, it requires a bit of thinking and studying things case by case, but it can be done. Okay, let's turn to Shushan now. Shushan Doidoyan, Director of the Freedom of Information Center in Armenia. It'd be interesting to hear your perspective a little bit more at the national level on how information has been impacted by the pandemic, and also in the context of a moment in which we're about to see, on the 1st of December 2020, we're going to have the Council of Europe Convention on Access to Official Documents coming into force. And Armenia has recently signed this convention, not ratified it yet, but you have signed it. Do you see that international instruments like this will actually help strengthen the right? What are the kind of challenges you've had? And what are your hopes for the signing and ratifying of this convention, and how it might also help guide us in terms of the priorities that we need to be acting upon going forth? Over to you, Shushan.
Thank you, Helen. It was very symbolic that the convention was signed by the Armenian government during pandemic. It was signed in June of this year, and but it doesn't mean that our government didn't apply any limitations on access to information and freedom of the press also. The Convention on Access to Information document was, that it was adopted 12 years ago, and we all waited so long to get necessary signatories and ratifications. And the signature of our government was, it demonstrates the political will of our government. towards transparency and a commitment to the right of access to information. Although the Armenian national legislation on freedom of information sets higher standards than the convention, and it provides even greater access to information. However, the convention will be effectively used by the civil society and the government for implementation, practice, monitoring, compliance, which remains a significant problem. I think it's not only a problem in Armenia, but also in many other countries. The convention will also help the local CSOs to push forward the issue of establishment of access to information oversight body. It's an important topic here and have been very actively discussed among the civil society and the government. And we are now in the process of defining which model to choose for establishment of oversight body. We will also use the convention to strengthen our national legislation as well as to further improve the access to information implementation practice. The Armenian and like many other governments, Armenian government also imposed several limitations when the emergency situation was entered in March 2020. But, and it should be noted that in the beginning phase, the whole process was very much chaotic and unorganized. And we registered many cases that the government compliance with the time allowed to respond to information requests have been fallen. Requests have been delayed, and incomplete answers or even mute refusals have been provided to the requesters. And but our observations show that late or incomplete answers have not been provided due to a tendency to hide information, but mostly because of lack of internal coordination among the state institutions, but also lack of human resources of state bodies. We had cases of some state institutions, information departments of which staff of information departments have been infected with virus, and just verbally there is no one to answer these requests. The good thing that when the local civil society organizations started to criticize the government for the set limitations, restrictions already in mid-April, highlighting that controlling information doesn't help to fight pandemic, but spread rumors and fears. Right followed after this criticism and public statements made by the civil society, the government started to organize internal discussions with the civil society, trying to find a better way to combat disinformation around pandemic. And as a result of these internal consultations, most part of the restrictions have been already eliminated and removed, reflecting the most part of the suggestions of the civil society. And as I said already, in June, the government signed the convention and is in active process of ratification completion. Also, I would like to highlight one more important issue that have been already touched upon by other speakers, is the privacy and access to information balance. It's important to stress here that it's the people's right of access to their personal data. Many governments started tracing of citizens for the fight against pandemia. The same happened here in Armenia. But on the other hand, citizens did not have enough resources or opportunities to have access to information, what kind of personal data is being processed and which institutions, public or private, are processing them, what is being done to ensure adequate level of protection and security of their personal data, as well as provide clear information on the results achieved by the implementation of the tracing measures. So it's very important to highlight that the governments need to be maximum transparent and accountable as possible when using tracing tools and surveillance tools.
Wonderful, thanks very much indeed, Shushan. And yes, that last point about the need for transparency about how personal data is being used is an incredibly important one that's come up a lot in the last few months. We've had a couple of Well, and on the convention, just to say that Access Info actually issued a call today for governments around Europe who haven't yet done like Armenia has done. We only have around, we've got 10 governments who've ratified the convention, which is why it's coming into force, and another 7 or 8 who've signed it, but there are many more, 47 in the Council of Europe region. And I'm pleased to say that the Spanish government announced today and formally put in their Open Government Partnership Action Plan a commitment to sign and ratify the Convention on Access to Official Documents. So making these commitments, because these commitments then translate into our legal frameworks, which we can then hopefully translate into practice. Although what we've been hearing, and we had an anonymous question in the chat there, what we've been hearing is that the question was about what we need, what are the challenges? And I think we've been hearing from all our panelists the multiple challenges and the weaknesses we've seen in our information infrastructures during this pandemic, and it gives us a clear agenda for how to try to address them. And if we've got clarity on our agenda, well, that's a first step at least. We had another question that came in from Toby McIntosh, a journalist who's been working on specifically reporting on the developments on freedom of information around the world for quite a number of years now, at least since the Right to Know Day was first put forward by the Freedom of Information Advocates Network. And Toby comments, there is no international standard on which information should be disclosed about pandemics. Not even the WHO has such a standard. What should be done about this? I think this slightly goes back to what we were asking you, Ania, about whether we should actually have more standards on precisely which data we should be publishing. Do you think or do you or any of the panelists think it would be useful to start working on these standards? Do we go back to the basics of what we've already got, like Delia said, or do we start coming up with new specific norms for pandemics? There's a quick question. Could I have really sort of 30-second reflections from the panelists on that in the same order, starting with Ilaria?
Yeah, I mean, Toby McIntosh is right. I mean, I was surprised as well when the pandemic started that there is obligation under international law for states to submit information to WHO about data about the pandemic, but doesn't exist the same obligation towards their citizens, no obligation to inform the public about the pandemic. And this is not the first pandemic in the world's history, on the first pandemic that WHO is facing. So that was really concerning. I think this should be a point and a priority in the international agenda to get this obligation for member states. So I think really support this as next step.
Perfect, thanks very much. In fact, we're seeing slightly the same thing with the Sustainable Development Goals, where there has to be reporting to the UN bodies, but it's not clear really quite what information has to be made public. And we should always think of the public as the first recipients, not the last ones of information. Delia, could I turn to you on this question, please? Microphone, Delia.
They have muted me. I was saying that I agree completely with Anita when she says that standards matters. And probably we have been late in this situation, but we will face another emergency. So one of the lessons learned in point of view of data collection, information access, accountability, transparency is that if there is an emergency, we have to have emergency tools to face and fulfill other rights. For instance, access to information or accountability. If it is an emergency, well, we will put in place emergency rules to guarantee access to information, etc. And particularly in my country, we are surprised now, particularly because of a situation like this, because the government of the largest province in Argentina announced on Friday that they have found, this was the wording, 3,500 deaths COVID deaths that has not been reported. They have lost them in the air. And simultaneously with that public announcement, the national government is not counting these 3,500 deaths in the national count of death. So, of course, what we need in order to build or rebuild trust, as the video says, is to have truth. And truth means facts, not narratives. So the quality of the data and the standardization of how are we going to measure what in what time is essential in order to compare the information and to inform the public, because this is not just throwing data. This is giving the needed information in order to take decisions, either at the level of the government, if we are talking lots of evidence-based policies, but also in the personal lives of people. How are we going to react whether the situation is A or B? How dangerous is the situation? How serious is the situation? We cannot trust in what we are being informed by the government. We have a personal problem with our health, with our future, with our reaction vis-a-vis the emergency.
Well, that is quite a striking story. I've seen other adjustments in the figures, but nothing on that scale, and it merits trying to understand how on earth that happened. Anya, do you have a comment on that, or the question from Toby McIntosh about the need for more standards?
Yes, and I think this is a really, really important question. As I mentioned previously, you know, I really think that standards do matter, but I also think that we need to be smart about how we operationalize them. And for anyone that's worked or been involved in designing and implementing data standards, it's an increasingly challenging, resource-intensive process that during times of crisis when resources are already stretched and you need to respond fast, I believe it's something that we should aim for, but we can do so in a way that we're talking about aiming for greater consistency in how data is being shared as we're learning, and most importantly, thinking about what we already have in place, not, you know, reinventing the wheel. Sometimes it's often about, you know, identifying existing standards, common identifiers, or practices that are already in place that we can think about smarter ways to make those interoperable, but also being aware of what are the capabilities in place within different areas, units of government, different countries and jurisdictions, so that we can think of standards as a maybe phased approach to, you know, what is the most basic things that in terms of information that's needed, and then gradually be building up upon them.
Super, thank you. Those are very useful recommendations. Shushan, how do you see it in Armenia? Have you had issues with the quality of the data that's been collected during the pandemic, and how do you think that impacts on public trust in what people are being told by the government?
Of course we have. As I said, journalists and civil society often received incomplete answers. Very generalized data was provided without any specific details. And even we say that the same answers can be copied and provided to anyone responding to another issues, because these are very generally formulated answers. Eventually, the data quality, I think, is a key issue that should become also a topic for strategic litigation launched by civil society. As for the emergency rules and standards, I think emergency rules should become a part of national access to information rules, and governments and civil societies should consider this in the process of reforming their access to information laws or developing new ones. And I think these emergency rules also can be included in the codes of conduct of civil servants within the administration. During the emergency situation, there have been very many limitations, but one of them I would like to share with you is the ban on panic-provoking information and the demand coming from the government that everyone should publish information only official viewpoints and should quote only official sources. And the definition was so wide and general, the definition of panic-provoking information, and the police should define whether the content published by the media is panic-provoking or not. And we have been many cases that even the police visited newsrooms and asking news staff to delete this or that information only because they consider information may provoke some panic in the society. Of course, as I said, these kind of stupid limitations were very specific to the early stages, and very shortly they have been just removed, totally removed. I also would like to talk a bit about what kind of lessons we have learned after this long 6 months period of emergency situation. I think in order to effectively fight against pandemic with access to information, using access to information as a tool, the government should take the following necessary measures. First of all, ensuring proactive access to information, which is crucial because it saves everyone's time and resources, and it allows everyone, whenever they want and need information, just get it through free open data format. Proactive provision of information about government activities ensures higher public trust and confidence towards the government, and mobilizes collective efforts for crisis management. Second issue that again, I think it's an important lesson. It was an important lesson for us is how to fight against disinformation about pandemic. This information happened everywhere in the world, and it really it created a huge damage and threatens people's life. In response to the increase in false, misleading and inflammatory disinformation, it is necessary, I think, to equip everyone, every citizen, and especially the youth, with tools and skills needed not only to have access to information, but also to critically assess this information and to differentiate what is fact and what is opinion, what is a quality data and what is just an opinion or somebody's point of view. And media literacy should not be limited to learning about tools and technologies, but should aim to equip citizens with the critical thinking skills. And finally, as I already mentioned about this issue, during the crisis, the citizens' right to personal data is of crucial importance and should be protected with all measures. And the government should be maximum transparent and accountable while tracing people's personal data.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Shushan. You've moved us on to really looking forward to what we need to do next. And we've had questions about that, in fact, coming in through the chat. Clearly, it's very concerning because sometimes it's the truth which may be a bit scary. I'm not saying necessarily provoke panic, but we need to know the truth. If there's a pandemic going on, it's kind of scary. So trying to suppress true information is highly problematic. At the same time, we want to ensure that any measures taken to combat false information, fake news, etc., are not done in ways that result in censorship. What we're going to do now, we've got about 20 minutes left, max. We've answered some of the questions that we had in our second round. So for the panelists, what I propose is that we have the next 1-minute video from our colleagues at UNESCO. And then I'm going to ask each of you, and as another quick wrap-up round, to give 1 or 2 recommendations for what you think should be priorities for action. First, for intergovernmental organizations, so UNESCO, World Health Organization, Open Government Partnership, if you like, whoever you want to direct your recommendation to, and 1 for civil society, okay? What should be our priorities going forward in the next period of this pandemic? Because I do stress that it seems that we're really still inside the pandemic. But what should we be doing in the next few months or even in the next year. So when we meet again next year, maybe by video, maybe in person, we'll be able to say, yes, this is what we achieved. Okay, before I ask you to answer those questions, I'm going to hand over to UNESCO for a video with some testimonials from Mexico. Thank you.
Hiñik aba hiñet Lucía, quecher hiñet sukia anti kalis si kamhel COVID-19. Ven añe chikani bal chanye chilis subochi lak chan, come mela kochaño li lak pilo mach buyu holo bikash lan chan, yikot lak lumal yomush kotik chami mele nya chaño, chami mele kun chaño bibo. Chatsak kochichi lak lumal chak pechelel subol, sakai wen kun chaño bibo, sakai poko bikup, sakai kunyo pishli ye yikot manik micholo kelo kipashal. Alak pilo tsabuwen kahiyo chumbeño bisum. Bacheli chichoño yo chokyako yulo buñikancheo che tecnologías si kocha yo chaklak pilo mach buyulo bikash lanchán ilak ñochelo si chayo chakirayo come ora miña chaño yo mach lahalik che tsibu bila chi come año mach buyuhu lo bik pehkanchel hun.
My name is Emmanuel Inibiona. I'm a Senior Public Relations Officer at the Ministry of Health, Uganda. My daily routine involves giving information to the general public about how the epidemic is evolving, issuing press releases on the guidance by scientists about the pandemic. In addition, I also respond to misinformation that keeps popping up about the COVID pandemic in Uganda. We largely employ a feedback-led communication mechanism that employs use of social media to counter misinformation and disinformation in real time.
Thanks very much. I think that video is very interesting because on the one hand, it shows the needs, the information needs that people have, but that we should also recognize there are many people working in public bodies who are doing their very best to get information collected and get it out to the people who need it. Ilaria, coming to you, based on that, everything we've discussed, what would your recommendations be? We've got, just to let everyone know, we've got about 12, 13, 14 minutes left on this webinar, so try to be brief. But if you could really highlight specific recommendations for next steps and for action.
Will try to do my best to come to.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my main points are about the attention that government should take to the most vulnerable communities in responding to the pandemic and regarding access to information. As Article 19, we have been working with vulnerable communities, and the video at the very beginning has been done by my colleagues in Mexico who have been supporting indigenous women in accessing information. And this, of course, the barriers they were already facing were exacerbated by the pandemic. And so communities really needed the support of the civil society. And our role has been really to use the information transmitted by the government that came to the communities very late. In Mexico, the first official information to the communities arrived at the end of April, where the first official case were reported at the end of February. So very late and in Spanish, so not in the local language. So what we have done concretely was to prepare information in the language and in the means that were more appropriate for them, and information that was more important for them. And this has been done with the preventive measures and how to react in case they were facing the disease. Women were really, particularly women, because this was our experience, were totally unprepared, were very concerned. They didn't know which healthcare facilities to reach. And so we started sharing audios and videos in the local radio communities and via WhatsApp in order to really reach them. And this has been done in 5 different local languages. So it was really a big campaign this Article 19 is doing to support this community. So in our research, this was just a concrete example, but what we observe in all other offices located in other areas of the world is that we have identified some key information that governments should proactively publish in order to support and take into consideration local communities or vulnerable communities. For example, it was very important to publish what decisions and policies were aimed at these groups and minorities and how much they were spending to do these special programs to help them. Another information that was crucial to publish, and I really care particularly about, is information about violence against women and reports. In some cases, this information were not published for some time. So this was really a lack of support also on the women that were coming out to report. They sometimes were facing even more difficult environments, staying at home and taking care of their household. And of course, governments to also make sure that information share all areas of the community. So what we have recommended is that it's not sufficient that governments just put the information on their website if the communities are not able to access that information. So really, they should use the means that are most appropriate for them, meaning prepare information to be shared in local radios or through newspapers, or reach directly the community groups and provide them with information. And another area is about communication strategy. So particularly there were issues concerning literate people in some area of the world. So really this is important for governments to take into account. Civil society is there to help, but it's a big effort to do, and government should cooperate. And what we have really recommended is also that when governments takes decision that target of have very a particular impact on a vulnerable group on community, they should be taken consulting and with their participation, because this is really important in order also to take into account the social, cultural, and religious belief, because sometimes for community with some cultural background it was very difficult to understand the emergency of the pandemic. And the last vulnerable group I want to mention that is important is about people with disabilities. So it is really important that there is information also to be shared in sign language and share through accessible technology, and also in a language that is not, in this case, translated, but in a plain language that is easily understandable also from people with disabilities. I hope I was brief enough.
Yeah, that's fine. I've actually just clarified with UNESCO the time. We've got till 5:20, so we've got 15 more minutes, but that was absolutely fine, Ilaria. I think it's really important that you've been doing this work on the ground and you've got these experiences, lessons learned and best practices. I think one of our challenges that we've seen during the course of the pandemic is how we best share the best practices on the right of access to information, on ensuring that all groups get informed. And I think that that's where we should make even better use of international fora. I mean, obviously UNESCO's part of the goal of UNESCO in holding these debates here today is to bring us all together, government, civil society, intergovernmental organizations, so that we can share best practices. We also have fora like the Open Government Partnership, which works very, very much to bring civil society and governments together in designing action plans which can learn from the best practices which are done in other countries. So it sounds like, as well as the specific concrete measures which you have outlined there, Ilaria, what we really need to do is to ensure that people are informed about what needs to be done and how to do it, in order that we can make sure that everyone is informed and not just the more privileged, that we can overcome the digital divide and get information to absolutely everyone who needs it to protect themselves, their lives, their families' lives during this pandemic. Great, thanks. So Delia, I mean, how do you see it in terms of the agenda going forward on anti-corruption and governance, as well as transparency, integrity? What should we be recommending and to whom, and how do we actually, to the extent that we've got the basics that you mentioned in your first intervention, we know what the basics are, how do we ensure that we really do get back to them and that we translate these policies and guidelines, things like you see in the UN Convention Against Corruption, which is packed with measures that governments should take, but they're not yet taking them. How do we make that happen now?
Of course, as I have said, laws are important, rules are important, but they are not enough. We need to implement and we need to enforce. And taking from what you were saying, number one thing is SDG 17, collective action, because we cannot resolve this in isolation. So we have to work together. This kind of interchange, to exchange of information, exchange of learning processes is quite important. And it is very important to act collectively when we have to ask governments to do something and to force them to respect the rights of the people or the use of the resources for the common good. So we have to act together, and that will help us to be stronger. To multilaterals and international platforms circulating money in packages of emergency response, we need to include in those packages accountability measures, transparency measures, access to information measure, and not just as a commitment. We need budget lines saying we are going to use this money to check that the resources goes to those in need, and we can prove that. This emergency, this humanity emergency has been very interesting from the point of view of corruption, because in other humanitarian crises, the complaints about corruption and the reports came very late after the humanitarian crisis was over. In this case, the corruption cases and corruption reports have been concomitant from the very beginning, and have been moving from Asia Pacific to Latin America as the COVID pandemic goes on. So we are receiving the reports, we have to act on that. To the governments, we need them to protect fundamental rights. One of them is access to information, but also privacy. And many governments, even in Europe, has been trying to override privacy issues. And it was very interesting in this contact app fever that we had in many governments, that it was Google and Apple to state that the API they were creating would be allowed to be used only for decentralized information, no government collecting everything regarding to our data. So that was a very interesting case. We need them to protect investigative journalism and scientists informing about the situation, because we have seen in many countries attacks, and Shoshan was mentioning one excuse to attack freedom of the press, which is this pandemic provoking notes. Or notices or news. In some countries, we have been talking about governments stopping fake news. Wonderful, very dangerous. This is concentration of power, and this is attacking our main freedoms of expression, opinion, and the freedom of the press. And from civil society, we have to ask for information, to monitor the use of resources, to help people get access to true information, not whatever narrative the governments want to present, and to fight fake news, and to take care of social media in terms of information circulation, because the phenomenon has been very, very important. So many things to do, but we have to do it collectively, together.
Thanks very much, Delia. Yes, I think your observation that this year we've actually seen corruption being exposed much more in real time is actually a testament to the work of civil society and investigative journalists, and also to some whistleblowers. And we mustn't forget the protection of whistleblowers as something that's terribly important as well, that we are able to respond a little bit more rapidly. We understand the nature of the problems and we are able to respond to them. And that maybe helps us understand exactly what we need, the mechanisms that we need to strengthen going forward. The laws definitely, but also putting those into the implementation of those laws and protecting the civil society actors. And you did mention one thing, which is money. It's not only follow the money, but it's also ensuring that the funding is there for the investigative journalists to do their work, for the civil society organizations to ensure that information gets out to more marginalized communities, for us to defend the right of access to information, to do what Shushan mentioned, which is sometimes to litigate against censorship or against refusals to provide information. All of that also requires funding. Fantastic. We're getting multiple, and just before I come to Anya and Shushan in our last minutes, I just want to look at some of the things that we've been getting in the chat. Ola Elzain, you've been asking us about what information shouldn't be shared. I think that we've answered that a little bit with the question of protecting health privacy. Health information is considered highly sensitive personal data. So clearly the health status of any individual should not be shared at the same time as sharing information about the pandemic more generally. There's been a question as well, or Victoria Barres has been commenting about strengthening civil society. Well, we've just touched upon that. Thank you for the kudos to all, Victoria. I see Sophia from the Carter Center is talking about the work you're doing in Guatemala to reach women with information about COVID-19. Let me see if we've got other. Aziz Tajuddin from the Center for Development in Nigeria, also talking about the need to work on awareness mechanisms to increase access to information at the grassroots level. So we're seeing the same issues coming up from the panelists and from our audience of around 120 people that we've got on the Zoom. And I know we've got a lot more people following us on YouTube. And I find that rather heartening because I think it shows that we've got a bit more clarity, perhaps, thanks to all the discussions we've had during the course of the last 6 or 7 months. We've got clarity on what our agenda is. Let's turn to our other two panelists now. Anya Calderon, I'm keeping in the same order here. Some last reflections from you, Anya?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about concrete actions for starting with civil society. I think it's about changing narratives, starting by acknowledging that the public's right to know and protecting privacy are both part of a central task of strengthening democracies and building citizenship. This, I think, will require a lot of bridging across data communities that have, I think, traditionally really worked in silos. We need to do more to work together, bring both the transparency and privacy camps together if we want to drive collective action, as has already been mentioned. I really like Sarah Ego's definition of balancing privacy and openness at the individual level when she talks about securing the boundaries between your private affairs and public identity as an act of citizenship. And if we take this to a societal level, we need to recognize these not as fixed concepts, but rather practices that evolve over time, especially with the advent of new technologies that can increasingly track and predict our behavior. So it helps that we're now recognizing, I think more so, that data exists on a spectrum. Some should be open by default, some kept close, and others sensibly shared. And these varying degrees of openness and safeguards should demonstrate a balance of rights in each case. And I think that is a central role for civil society organizations to showcase. And for intergovernmental organizations, I think it's about supporting and testing data governance models at scale in transparent and participatory ways. Helen, you already mentioned the role of open government partnership in doing this together, bringing governments and civil societies together. I think we can do more in aiming to make these governance models content specific and dynamic, where the benefits of data can be stewarded for public purpose. At the Open Data Charter, we advocate for governments to publish with purpose, so that access to information is fairly distributed, while we're also aiming to mitigate risks and harms. And I guess to conclude, just in more general terms, I think it's about expanding and enforcing our data rights in ways that access to information and data-driven decisions seek to protect society as a whole, but they're also keeping power in check and building a new kind of table that is able to bring everyone on board and expand values of agency, equity, and accountability through the use of data.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ania, both on those considerations of the spectrum of data. It's not all the same, and we need to look at case by case which data should be published, and also having in mind the purpose. The publish with purpose is terribly important. Shushan, I'll turn to you for a couple of last thoughts, please.
I have 4 practical recommendations for the CSOs where they can be mostly helpful. First of all, as I mentioned, it's in strategic litigation area where the civil society organizations may assist, especially the media, journalists, to have access to accurate information about the pandemic. In all cases, I recommend our local journalists to start appeal process of illegal refusals or mute refusals or incomplete answers. So CSOs may be very helpful in this. The second recommendation, as I mentioned, is supporting people to fight against disinformation and to understand what is true and what is false, to equip the people with necessary knowledge and skills, fact-checking tools. The third area of activity for CSOs, I think it's close cooperation with the governments to introduce new electronic e-governance tools to ensure wider and easier access to information. Just an example from our local context, during the emergency situation, Armenian central government bodies received in total 17,600 information requests. And out of these requests, 16%, only 16% was submitted in hard copy. And the resting 84% of requests received in electronic version. So these electronic e-governance resources significantly reduce the time and technical resources, costs for getting access to information. And the last recommendation, my favorite one, may be to work closely with the governments and to encourage them to finally sign and ratify the Convention on Access to Information, which will be really a great support to not only their country, but to our Council of Europe community. International binding document, this one is of high importance to help increasing transparency and access to information, and also privacy.
Wonderful, thanks very much, Shushan. Well, I can heartily support the last recommendation. It's something that Access Info has really been pushing for over the years. Also, along with many organizations in Europe, and we hope that the European Convention can set a standard for other regions of the world as well. I also hope that some money is put into the monitoring and oversight body for that. And if I can abuse for 1 second my position as the moderator, my recommendation to the intergovernmental organizations, to UNESCO, to the OECD, to the Open Government Partnership would be to strengthen the measurement of the right of access to information, not only the laws, but also levels of transparency and practice. UNESCO has been working on this under its responsibilities to monitor compliance with the Sustainable Development Indicator 16.10.2, but I don't think yet we really have anything like enough data on how well implemented this right of access to information is. And that's something that we definitely need. I'm going to have to do some wrapping up now. The time's flown by. We're getting some thanks coming in the chat and the Q&A functions to all the panelists. And I'd like to echo those thanks to Ilaria Favola from Article 19, Delia Ferreira Rubio from Transparency International, Ania Calderon from the Open Data Charter, and Shishan Dodoyan of the Freedom of Information Center, Armenia, all organizations which have been working and have helped us advance thus far the right of access to information. And I'm sure that with whom we'll be working as we go forward in the future. I've been asked to mention the Open Government Partnerships Open Government Guide series, which was updated during the course of the pandemic. And there is a guide on the right of access to information, which I urge you all to look at on the Open Government Partnership website. That was put together by myself with Toby Mendel of the Centre for Law and Democracy in Canada, who was moderating the high-level panel that we had earlier this afternoon, and Mukaleni Dimba from South Africa, who was also a former member of the Open Government Partnership Steering Committee. This really is, as we can see today, defending and promoting the right of access to information really is a global effort where all the actors, government representatives, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, investigative journalists, academics, and others work together to advance this right. We're living through a pandemic. We're in the age of the pandemic, which none of us would have imagined this time last year, but this is the reality that's hit us. But we're also very much in the information age. And my fervent hope is that this information age, these technological tools we've got, the information that we can now gather and share is something which help us not only overcome this pandemic, but come out of it with stronger democracies, greater respect for human rights, reduced levels of corruption. I think if we all work together, that is something that we can achieve. And with that optimistic vision towards the future, I'd like to thank all of you. Thanks to all the people who've been listening online. And I'd like to thank very much Marius and all your colleagues at the UNESCO for putting this webinar together, for all the work you've been doing to defend and promote the right of access to information. And I'll hand over to the colleagues at UNESCO. I think we've got a last 1-minute video before we actually close. Have a good evening, everybody, or afternoon if it's still morning for you. Enjoy the rest of this day of talking about the challenges, but also celebrating the right of access to information, and really looking forward to working with you all as we go forward to advance this right. Thanks very much, everybody. Okay, once again, thank you very much. And thanks also to my colleagues at Access Info for everything they've been doing supporting me during this webinar. Once again, we'll be in touch soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
And bye-bye.